The BND's work is secret.
Until it became public in the 2000s.
Journalisten bespitzeln Journalisten, kritische Reporter werden bis in ihr Privatleben ausspioniert.
Die bezeichne ich nicht mehr als Journalisten oder Kollegen.
Journalists becoming agents, and paid ones at that.
I was both a journalist and an employee of the BND.
When he saw the list, he couldn't believe his eyes.
There was always a BND car with a camera inside.
What really happened back then, and what's the relationship like today?
The use of journalists by intelligence agencies is by no means the norm.
Journalists and the BND. How close should they be? A small town in the Upper Palatinate in southern Germany. We were here to meet former journalist Wilhelm Dietl. For 11 years, he was also an agent for the German Foreign Intelligence Service, the BND. He lives above a former indoor swimming pool. Dietl uses the entire swimming pool area as a private archive. It contains documents and books spanning several decades, as well as an extensive press archive. And it starts up there?
93.
Insanely high.
7 meters.
In the 1980s and 90s, Dietl was a successful foreign correspondent, at first for the magazine Quick.
That was the last year, 1992.
Quick was a weekly news magazine, as was Focus, Dietl's main employer later on. His travels often took him to crisis zones. In 1989, Quick sent him to meet Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat. He was also part of the team that broke a major story about the internationally wanted terrorist Carlos the Jackal for the magazine Stern.
For example, I obtained these surveillance photos of Prague airport from the Interior Ministry in Prague.
He also reported on attacks by the RAF terrorist group in Germany. No one suspected back then that Dietl had been working a second, secret job since 1982. That was 86, during the time you were mainly working for the BND?
The BND had nothing to do with my reporting on the attack. This was 100% journalistic work.
The BND, Germany's foreign intelligence agency, had approached Dietl in 1982, offering him an undercover job. Dietl agreed and became a BND employee. But why?
A quieter phase set in, and Quick said, "Okay, enough with the Middle East for now. Let's get back to the heart and soul of Germany. You'll have to get really involved and not just meet with Arafat or the like." By then, I was so focused on the Middle East that I told myself, I definitely need the opportunity to keep working there so I don't lose my contacts and so I can stay on top of issues there.
He says he kept the two jobs strictly separate. When he was on assignment for a newspaper, he didn't do research for the BND, and vice versa.
Take this report here, for example. I delivered something like this to the BND back then.
For that assignment, the BND sent Dietl to Jordan to gather information on the Abu Nidal terrorist organization.
I was to learn everything I could about the organization, which was, after all, very secretive, very violent, and had carried out many attacks worldwide. Everything about the individuals and about the structure of the organization. In the end, I created things like these membership lists of the group. You can't mix that with journalism.
Dietl may be convinced he was able to keep the two activities separate. But he deceived his interview subjects and always presented himself as a journalist. And the public in Germany also knew nothing of this dual role.
Und wenn man jetzt an die Leserinnen und
Speaking
Leser
of the
der
readers of Quick, they were
denen war ja
unaware
nicht
that you
bewusst,
weren't
dass
just
sie
working as a
eben nicht nur
journalist, but were also
eine
working for the
journalistische
government.
Tätigkeit ausüben, sondern dass sie auch für eine Regierung arbeiten.
Richtig.
Right, but not at that moment. Concerning Quick, I said, we have the chance to meet Arafat and interview him. Let's do it. The editor-in-chief said, yes, go ahead. So I went there for Quick and was paid by Quick. And Quick got the result they wanted, as you can see here in the magazine. And that was that.
But how independent and critical can a reporter's work be if he is secretly cooperating with the government? In the early 2000s, Dietl's work for the BND and other allegations came to light, events that would bring his journalistic career to an end.
Meistens kommt ja immer nur ein Bruchteil.
Close ties between the German Foreign Intelligence Service and journalists are nothing new. They were revealed in a now infamous document released decades ago. In Germany, the head of the Chancellery coordinates intelligence service activities. Starting in 1969 under Chancellor Willy Brandt, that role was held by Horst Emke. The Social Democrat wanted to know how closely the BND worked with journalists and instructed his team to compile a list of all journalistic contacts. When he saw the list, Emke was alarmed. The so-called special press contacts featured many prominent journalists of the era. Among them, the editor-in-chief of the newspaper Die Zeit, Countess Marion Dönhoff, and a director of a public broadcaster. He made the list public. Erich Schmidt-Enbohm has written many books critical of the BND. In one of them, he examines the collaboration between the BND and journalists.
Here's the infamous document from October 1974. They were neatly divided into categories. Roman numeral 1, 66. Those were the essential ones, because Roman 1 meant permanent, important contacts. Roman 2 were still formal contacts, contacts as needed. Under Roman 3, still 116 people were chance contacts, or so-called prospective agents.
And from your perspective, Category 1 means?
Those were the really hot agents who, fully aware of their role, were in touch with a BND liaison. They had a special ID number and were either paid or had their travel expenses covered. Even in the case of Countess Dönhoff, it came to light that she had her trips financed by the BND. And that, of course, is an absolute violation of journalistic independence.
Marion Dönhoff, the former editor-in-chief of Die Zeit. She and the BND have always denied that they collaborated. On German television, Dönhoff said a gentleman would stop by her office from time to time.
Dass der hier aufgekreuzt ist, so wie auch andere Leute kommen, Journalisten von Ausland und so, und sich mal 10 Minuten unterhalten oder eine Viertelstunde. Ich wäre natürlich nie auf den Gedanken gekommen, dass ich dadurch zu einem Mitarbeiter des MHD werde. BND.
Our research could not establish the exact nature of the relationship. In response to an inquiry from Die Zeit in 2013, the BND stated, there was no indication of a possible intelligence gathering assignment or any remuneration for the Countess. Schmidt-Enbohm experienced firsthand just how easily the line of journalistic and editorial independence can be blurred. Shortly after publishing a book critical of the BND, he received a phone call. The caller was a high-ranking BND official, codename Bessel. He wanted to meet with Schmidt-Enbohm to discuss his criticism of the BND. Bessel dropped by the Institute that evening, after everyone else had already left. From then on, the two met regularly, with Bessel hoping to get information from Schmidt-Enbohm. In return, the agent offered the journalist expensive gifts, a built-in kitchen, a copier, even 10,000 Deutschmarks. Schmidt-Enbohm insisted he always refused the gifts, but he overlooked one. Why are journalists and their information so interesting to the BND? We dropped by the agency's visitor center to find out. The BND's goal is to gather information from abroad. At the same time, Germany guarantees freedom of the press, which means journalists must be able to work independently. Collaborating with the BND jeopardizes that, at the very least. How does the BND view this tension? Its press spokesperson was only willing to provide a few statements. Why do intelligence agencies like the BND consider journalists to be interesting sources of information?
The BND is the German Foreign Intelligence Service. It collects and evaluates necessary information on foreign countries, countries which must always be of significance to the Federal Republic of Germany in terms of foreign and security policy. It does this using various intelligence-gathering means and methods. Talking with human sources is one of those methods.
And journalists are among those human sources. For the BND, this cooperation has few downsides. But for journalists, it's another story. If they get too close to the intelligence service, they risk their credibility. We visited journalist Lars Petersen to discuss these potential pitfalls. He is head of investigations for the news portal Business Insider, the newspaper Die Welt, and Politico. He regularly works with intelligence information when compiling investigative stories, and also meets with BND staff for background briefings.
It's not like we're in some dark booth or anything like that. It's usually just a walk.
Background conversations in the forms of walks are certainly something unusual.
Yes, it is unusual. But I can understand that people don't want to meet in closed rooms or restaurants, which is otherwise quite common in political circles, for example in Berlin, because there's always someone sitting in the room to your left and right who might be eavesdropping.
According to Petersen, these types of conversations always involve some exchange of information, something you can't prevent completely.
You reveal something just through asking questions. You might say, I've heard it differently because I did this or that. That kind of exchange is very normal and okay. But what we've seen in the past is different. Journalists have actively offered themselves and said, I can tell you something, tell you about things that happen in my newsroom or that individual journalists have experienced. That's completely unacceptable.
In other words, Petersen thinks journalists cross a red line when they volunteer to become sources for the BND. So, why do some journalists get involved in espionage, even when it's clear that by doing so, they jeopardize not only their own work, but also the reputation of all journalists? Daniel Maasbrücker pursued this question for his doctoral thesis, speaking with numerous journalists and former agents.
For journalists, the BND is fascinating, whether you're working with them or just reporting on them. The BND's work is secret, and it's always about the really big issues, terrorism, national security. That means if you find out something, if you manage to uncover something, that's a journalistic achievement.
After long retention periods, the BND sometimes releases confidential files. In them, Daniel repeatedly found examples of journalists passing on information.
It's journalists simply talking about things happening within their own organizations or things happening at the competition.
In his conversations with eyewitnesses, Daniel noticed a pattern. Journalists quickly come under pressure to reveal something themselves.
Once you start having conversations, you realize that agencies operate according to the principle of do ut des, Latin for I give so that you give. An intelligence agency only shares information with other agencies if those have something to offer in return.
In some cases, however, not everyone involved seems to be aware of the give-and-take principle. Erich Schmidt-Einbohm, the vocal critic of the BND, recounted how he apparently overlooked a gift from the BND. 3 separate donations the agency made to his institute.
It wasn't obvious that it was a BND donation. The first donation I received came from Munich, under the name of an executive committee member, a social democrat, from Weilheim. And from then on, I assumed that it was a perfectly normal donation. Since you often receive donations when someone has inherited money or when I've appeared on national television. Mr. Bessel didn't tell me until months later that the money was from the BND. And I was foolish enough not to transfer it back right away.
Would you say you made a mistake?
Yes, that was careless. I should have transferred it back right away or handed it over in cash.
Reports at the time accused Schmidt-Einbohm of colluding with the BND.
Die Bezeichnung Spitzel für Herrn Schmidt-Einbohm ist grundfalsch. Richtig ist die Bezeichnung Komplize. Sie sind Komplize geworden dieser Leute.
Schmidt-Einbohm denied the accusation, pointing to his critical books as proof.
That would mean I'd be an accomplice of the BND, as someone who harmed the agency more than anyone else. So I could categorically deny that.
The complexity of the relationship between the BND and critical journalists is particularly evident in the case of Schmidt-Einbohm.
Turn right here.
We visited the former headquarters of his institute. Schmidt-Einbohm was both a critic and contact of the BND, and at some point he found himself in the BND's crosshairs. The agency wanted to know who provided him the insider information for his books.
They parked a car right out front here. There was a camera built into the car's sun visor, aimed directly at the Institute's entrance.
Here in the parking lot.
There was always a BND car with a camera inside.
For months, BND employees filmed every person who visited Schmidt-Einbohm here. They even searched through his waste paper for clues. It later turned out that Schmidt-Einbohm was not the only critic under the BND's scrutiny. The story broke in 2005, with many media outlets reporting on it with great fanfare.
Der Bundesnachrichtendienst hat grundsätzlich eingeräumt, Mitte der 90er Jahre Journalisten bespitzelt zu haben.
The outrage was so great that Parliament even appointed a special investigator, former federal judge Gerhard Schäfer. Schäfer was able to review many relevant files from the BND, including those in which BND employees meticulously documented the surveillance. He concluded the surveillance of journalists in Germany was largely illegal. But the report contained a second major revelation, that some journalists helped the BND investigate other journalists. Those accused faced sharp criticism in the public debate.
Journalisten bespitzeln Journalisten, die Staatsmacht zahlt hohe Honorare an Pressevertreter.
Käufliche Journalisten, ganz miese Typen.
Diese käuflichen, charakterschwachen Menschen, die bezeichne ich nicht mehr als Journalisten oder Kollegen.
We visited the man who sparked the scandal, Andreas Förster, then a reporter for the Berliner Zeitung newspaper. In November 2005, he published an article titled In the Crosshairs. In it, he revealed what Erich Schmidt-Einbohm had confided in him, that the BND had systematically monitored him and other journalists.
I tried to get to the bottom of it, to sort out the story somehow. I have to say, it was pretty intense. Of course, I didn't get any information from the BND about it, but I decided to write the article anyway. I did it partly to help shed light on the matter.
The Schäfer report revealed that Andreas Förster had also been monitored, and by a supposed colleague, no less. Someone informed him.
You were spied on by an informant. They had an informant tailing you and all that. That really hit me hard. I remember sitting in the car, talking to him on the phone, and being completely shocked. I hadn't expected that at all. That was the first shock. I hadn't yet anticipated that fellow journalists were also involved in this. That came as a second wave, which, to be honest, was even more intense.
The intelligence reporting community was small back then. People knew and trusted each other.
We used to be a pretty close-knit community. We all had the same goal. We wanted to critically examine intelligence work and somehow dig up great stories. We also like to push the agencies around a bit. It's fun, after all. Stuff like that. And then suddenly you realize that some of them were playing dirty, hiding their cards, and going behind our backs. That was a huge disappointment.
Two journalists quickly admitted that they had spied on colleagues. A third name was also quickly made public and denounced.
Wilhelm Dietl.
Wilhelm Dietl.
Wilhelm Dietl.
According to the Schäfer report, Dietl, codenamed Dali and Schweiger, is said to have met personally with BND department head Volker Fürch at least 177 times. Fürch took extensive notes on these meetings. According to these notes, Dietl divulged internal information from other newsrooms. For example, he is said to have told the BND where Der Spiegel had obtained its sources for a major cover story. But in the Schäfer report, the head of the BND at the time denied that Dietl had been tasked with spying on colleagues. Wilhelm Dietl has admitted he did undercover work for the BND, often in the Middle East. But in our conversations, he vehemently denied the accusation that he spied on fellow journalists. A few months later, reports by media outlets, including Zap, accused you of having been assigned to spy on newsrooms and journalists and report back to the BND. Is this accusation true?
Stimmt dieser Vorwurf?
The accusation is completely untrue. I don't know why it came about. I can't explain it. I just don't know, but many colleagues say it was jealousy due to my many successes, including as a journalist. They simply got rid of a competitor that way.
Saying he was wrongfully accused, Dietl took legal action against the news outlets that had aired the reports. The dispute ended with a settlement. Dietl maintained he merely discussed harmless matters with the BND.
Yes, we talked. And he said stuff like, the editor-in-chief of Der Spiegel will be so-and-so next month. So, nothing you could tell an intelligence agency that would make them say, wow, we never would have guessed that. It was just small talk on my part. The other stuff was very specific information about the media sector.
Dietl admitted that the BND department head asked him about the source of the cover story by Der Spiegel.
Volker Fürch asked me over lunch if I could imagine finding out how that plutonium report ended up in Der Spiegel. Well, I said, following the old Bavarian principle, we'll see. I did find out where Der Spiegel got that information, but I didn't tell the BND. And there's certainly no document showing that I came back from Hamburg and said, I know who it was. It was so-and-so. I didn't do that.
We know Dietl worked secretly for the BND for 11 years and that he denies spying on colleagues. The Schäfer report says he did. It's one person's word against another's, and our reporting was not able to uncover the truth. But based on our research, Dietl's version of events seems plausible. For his doctoral thesis, Daniel Maasbrucker also dealt extensively with the Dietl case and the debate surrounding it.
Legitimate criticism notwithstanding, he was sometimes treated unfairly. Things were attributed to him that he hadn't done. But it was a relief to be able to tell the story this way. Because if you say there's black and white, and there are a few black sheep, then you could use that to gloss over the fact that a lot of what occurred was in a gray area. And that many established professional journalists weren't always entirely clear either. They sometimes talked to the BND about each other's sources.
It's clear large parts of the media missed the opportunity for critical self-examination back then. Releasing the Schäfer report caused a major uproar, and the BND became the subject of public scrutiny. The outrage was so great that the BND was forced to make changes.
The Schäfer report's assessment stands on its own. The whole matter culminated in a specially revised set of service regulations. These specify conditions in which the use of journalists by intelligence services is legitimate. They also specify which department within the Federal Intelligence Service decides on the use of journalists and under what conditions.
But, as Heinemann stressed, it's not illegal for the BND to use journalists as sources.
There's no legal ban on initiating contact or anything of the sort. But the following is clear. The use of journalists by intelligence agencies is by no means to be the norm, but rather a considerable exception.
Heinemann refused to say whether the BND is currently making use of this exception, adding he generally does not comment publicly on intelligence findings. He then sent us the following note. Nothing herein should be construed as confirming or denying the correctness of the facts as presented. Banning contact between journalists and the BND as a matter of principle would be difficult.
In a country where freedom of the press is highly valued, that's probably the right approach. Otherwise, you'd also have to ban journalists from speaking with intelligence agencies. That's very difficult, which is why there's always been a reluctance to enact clear laws specifying what journalists and intelligence agencies are allowed to do.
It's not inherently problematic for journalists to speak with intelligence agencies. For many investigations, it's even necessary, and at least one red line is quite clearly defined.
It was always clear that a journalist is not allowed to work for the BND. That, I'd say, is clear. But where's the line exactly? Where does it start? When does a legitimate background conversation become reporting on the competition? Where are those boundaries? Hardly anyone in journalism had this discussion in the past, and it hasn't happened to this day.
How close are journalists allowed to get to an intelligence agency? It's a question the media should ask themselves time and again. And each individual's response could affect the credibility of the entire profession.